Wonderful. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for attending. It is a pleasure to be here, at least virtually, and I will be presenting today on positive epidemiology, or why I think we need a positive epidemiology. So I will make some remarks on the work I've been doing on this topic of well-being and flourishing, and some of our research efforts in that regard. And then I'll talk a little bit about the measurement of flourishing, but I'll move on in the second half of the talk to argue for why I think we need one might call a positive epidemiology. This topic of well-being is often viewed as falling within those who pursue psychology or positive psychology, but I think within epidemiology, the methods that we've developed, the approach to population health, and the cohort infrastructures we've been able to develop are such that if epidemiology itself moved towards contributing to this literature on well-being, there would be some tremendous advantages. So I will talk about what that might look like and why I think that might be valuable in the second half of the talk. But in a lot of this work that's being done is out of the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. If you want more information, I've included the website there, and some of the conceptual background of these two papers, one in PNAS in 2017 on the flourishing framework, and then a paper in epidemiology in 2020 entitled Positive Epidemiology ? And so I will try to make a case for the need for a positive epidemiology. So some of this is really motivated by the broad visions that many of our institutions and disciplines have, and including the World Health Organization. And their definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And likewise, if you look at the foundations of economics or positive psychology, they're aspiring to these broad visions. Economics is sometimes taken as the study how agents go about maximizing utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of the agent's preferences, so all aspects really of their well-being. But really, in practice, many of our studies and discussions are restricted to much more specific outcomes, specific disease states, simple measures of feeling happy, or economics to income, kind of missing this broader vision of flourishing. So what is flourishing or well-being? Well, turn to the dictionaries. The Oxford English Dictionary defines flourish as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The etymology of the term comes from Latin florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's the word often used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. Working definition been using is that flourishing or complete human well-being is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very broad, very all expansive, but this is arguably what we're after as individuals and really should be seeking, I think, as a society. I think the discipline that has come closest to trying to conceptualize and study this is that of positive psychology, and many conceptualizations and measures have been put forward, but notably absent from these measures and conceptualizations are any notion of physical health. And are we really fully flourishing if we're bedridden, if we're terribly ill? And I think some of that is because these measures have come out of psychology, focused on the mind, rather than public health or epidemiology. Missing from many of these is also any notion of character or virtue, contrary to Plato or Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition, and really philosophical, cultural, religious traditions worldwide. But with a conception so broad, we might wonder whether it's really ever possible to measure this or to study this empirically, and moreover, surely conceptualizations will differ across individuals and various cultural, philosophical, religious traditions. So can we ever really achieve any sort of consensus? And what I would argue is that although it is the case that well-developed conceptions of flourishing are going to vary across cultures and traditions, I think any reasonable conceptualization of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but again, any reasonable conception, I think, would include, perhaps amongst other things, these 5 as well. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these exhaust flourishing, but each is, I think, a part of it. I think each of these also satisfies the following two criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data on this now as well. And each is an end in and of itself. It's sought for its own sake, not merely as a means to attain other ends. And I think these two criteria, being nearly universally desired, being an end, might help shape some consensus around what to measure. So in our own empirical work, we've started employing a very brief, somewhat admittedly crude, flourishing assessment, essentially taking two questions in each of these 5 domains drawn principally from the existing literature on well-being questions that for the most part have received some degree of empirical validation and in many cases have had fairly widespread use in the well-being literature. These 10 questions are as follows. In the first domain, happiness and life satisfaction. First, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Scored 0 to 10, 0 completely unsatisfied, 10 completely satisfied. And this is perhaps one of the most widely used well-being questions in the literature. It's been used in the UK's annual survey, used by the OECD. It's been used by Gallup. It's in the this year's National Health Interview Survey here in the United States. So again, widely employed. And then we supplement that with something about that's more effective, feeling happy. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? 0, extremely unhappy, 10, extremely happy. Second domain, physical and mental health. These are just standard self-rated health questions. In general, how would you rate your physical health? 0 to 10. How would you rate your overall mental health? 0 to 10, drawn from the US General Social Survey and the WHO of mental health. Third domain, meaning and purpose. First, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? 0, not at all worthwhile, 10, completely worthwhile. This is also a very widely used well-being question, once again, in UK's annual survey by the OECD. Many cohort studies as well, in fact, have included this. And then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. 0, completely disagree, 10, completely agree. The fourth domain, character and virtue, these 2 items that were kind of newly developed in collaboration with philosophers, although there's been quite a bit of good work that's been done on assessing character over the last 15 years. There was not much in terms of global assessment. So the first question intended in some crude way to try to get at practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0, not at all true of me. 10, completely true of me. And then I am always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later, trying to get at fortitude and also moderation. And then the last domain, close social relationships. These 2 questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short social connectedness and loneliness instruments. First item, I am content with my friendships and relationships, trying in some sense to get at the quantity of those relationships. And then second, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to get at the quality of those relationships. As you'll see, we typically look at each of the 5 domains separately because the dynamics can be quite different across these various domains. Sometimes we will take a average of the 10 questions as a flourishing assessment, but really this should be understood as nothing more than a composite of those 5 more meaningful domain measures. We do typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as important means, very important means to sustain these other ends. So these 2 questions drawn from the financial well-being literature: how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0, worry all the time. 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? And so again, sometimes we'll average all 12 questions for more of a secure assessment of flourishing, perhaps a little bit less satisfactory conceptually, because we're looking at means here with these last 2 questions, not ends, but arguably more satisfactory in practice, indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. So we've collected, as I'll discuss shortly, data on these 12 questions in a number of different settings, in part for research purposes, but also in part for kind of diagnostic purposes. And really, it can be they can be helpful, I think, even for individual, personal reflection on one's own life, identifying areas of improvement, changes one wants to make, tracking over time. I try to go through them myself once a quarter to kind of understand what might be going well or not. But we've had lots of positive feedback in kind of educational and workplace settings using these questions on getting people to think and reflect on their lives, to make changes, realizing, seeking a greater purpose, and so on. But again, I think it can be useful in just trying to understand the state of an individual, but also a community of individuals as sort of a broad assessment of well-being generally. So to see how this can be helpful, and I'll give some other examples later. These are roughly nationally representative data of the United States on these various flourishing questions, both prior to the WHO declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic in January 2020, and then 6 months later in June of 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. Unsurprisingly, flourishing on average declined during this period, but interestingly, it affected different domains in different ways. Happiness and life satisfaction, again, unsurprisingly, fell from nearly 7 to 6.2. Physical and mental health, likewise, fell 0.7 of a point. Financial and material stability fell quite substantially, and January 2020 was really the height of unemployment in the United States during the pandemic, so substantial unemployment and job insecurity at that time. But interestingly, some of the other domains did not decline as much. Meaning and purpose went down a bit, but not all that substantially. Our character assessments were pretty much level. And somewhat surprisingly, close social relationships went down a little bit, but not that much, 0.2 of a point. And so I was kind of surprised by this, and it has been corroborated by other studies as well. And while this certainly was in some ways a difficult time socially, some people at least found ways to more deeply connect with family members or those living with or friends, or connecting via Zoom. However, these averages do disguise what was the increase in variability across all of these domains. So the standard deviation of each of these measures went up during the pandemic. Experiences were more variable. So while perhaps some people's social relationships even improved, there was evidence, for example, that children felt closer to their fathers during the pandemic. For others, this has clearly been a very difficult time, perhaps especially those living alone. So we should pay attention not just to the means, but the variation in experiences as well. And I'll come back to kind of other examples of where this sort of data, I think, can shed light on what is happening both individually and at a societal level. So we've collected this sort of data in a number of different settings: workplace settings, employees at Cola, Owens Corning, the World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, China, group of international flight attendants, in several clinical settings, mental health patients at VU, and medical students at Johns Hopkins, in fact, some other work at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center amongst cancer patients. Various universities, Yale, Stony Brook, York University, West Point, have all collected this data. I've yet to convince Harvard to do so systematically yet, but I think they're considering. Several secondary schools, various communities embedded it in this year's data collection efforts of the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard, UK's LSPEC study, the Japanese Gerontological Study, JADS, and are launching a global study of flourishing, which I'll come to momentarily. Some of the trends we've seen is that the financial domain is often ranked the lowest, not in all settings. It was not the case, for example, with the Aetna employees, but in many. Sort of those means are often a real struggle to attain. We've seen that social connection assessments tend to be higher in other countries than in the United States. So I think this should give us pause for concern. What are we not valuing this, or what's happening here in our country? We've found, and I'll come back to this point, that many of these dimensions, at least in the United States, are increasing with age, and But dynamics can differ across these different dimensions. So happiness tends to be higher in richer developed countries, but conversely, measures of meaning and purpose tend to be higher in poorer developing countries, which kind of leads, I think, to interesting questions. How do we bring about economic development in a way which does not compromise meaning and purpose? So to try to empower this work further and to launch what I'll be describing in the second half of this talk as a positive epidemiology, we are in the process of launching with Gallup a global flourishing study. This will be 240,000 individuals in 22 countries, nationally representative sampling within each country, where we collect data on the same cohort of 240,000 individuals, longitudinal panel data once a year over 5 years on sort of various well-being measures, the ones I've discussed, but also a broader range as well, along with potential economic, social, psychological, family, communal, spiritual, political determinants of well-being to try to understand better the distribution and determinants of well-being, to try to launch, in some sense, a positive epidemiology, which I'll be shortly discussing. This will be an open access data set hosted by the Center for Open Science, so anyone's welcome to make use of the data. I think we are in field now in 10 of the 22 countries, and hope to have the data, the first wave of data available and cleaned by perhaps May or June of next year. Okay, so what does all this well-being stuff have to do with epidemiology? And is any of it amenable to translation? And my view would be we have within epidemiology over the past decades developed an extraordinary research infrastructure to study health and illness. The concepts that are employed, the theory, the methods, and the cohort infrastructures that we have created really have been astounding in advancing our knowledge of health and learning things which we can use to promote health and well-being. And my view is that we should make use of all that we have learned, this infrastructure that we have built, to study, not just physical and mental health, but other well-being outcomes. We should leverage what we've learned in epidemiology and the approaches we've developed, our epidemiologic methods, our cohort infrastructures, to look not just at physical and mental health, but also happiness and meaning and character and relationships and financial resources. And I think in doing so, we'd be, in fact, moving closer to the vision of the World Health Organization's definition of health. So I want to comment briefly then on how I see this positive potential field of positive epidemiology, looking at positive outcomes, contributing. I think first, we can look at one thinks of epidemiology as the study of the distribution and determinants of health and disease, and one interprets health broadly as health of a person, well-being, flourishing, then I think we can first look at the distribution of well-being and try to discern what we've learned there and where interventions are needed, who needs additional help and care. So we could do a descriptive analysis, distributional analysis of flourishing. Second, I think we can turn to the determinants, to etiology, both studying the determinants of well-being, but also potentially positive factors that can contribute to well-being. And so I'll make some comments on each of those, both the distributions and study of determinants as applied not just to physical health, but to well-being more broadly. And then finally, I will suggest that as we expand our purview of epidemiology towards these broader set of considerations, well-being outcomes, that we may want to consider somewhat different templates for our studies, for our designs, that we might want to move towards what I've been calling outcome-wide studies, where we look at not just a single outcome one at a time, but looking at the relationship between particular exposures and a host of different outcomes simultaneously. If we really want to understand well-being or flourishing more holistically, that we should be doing so simultaneously. So I'll make some brief comments on these outcome-wide designs. So again, I think we need in part positive epidemiology so that we have adequate descriptive statistics on flourishing. How do these different flourishing outcomes, happiness, health, meaning, character, relationships, how do they vary by age, by race, by gender, by income, by disease conditions? We want to understand who is flourishing and who is not, and to what degree, and in what ways, who might need help, and if we are able to develop interventions to promote well-being, to whom should we target these? And I think often we just don't have good enough descriptive data. There's debate, for example, as to whether loneliness has increased over the last 3 or 4 decades, and the matter is disputed. The very best data we have seems to suggest possibly, but it's been criticized on very reasonable grounds. And while we have good data for the last 10 years or so, we don't, going further back. We need to do a better job of collecting well-being data simply for descriptive purposes. And I think this sort of well-being data can bring important insights as to where we need to focus. So I will give 2 examples here, these data coming from the Health and Retirement Study. So this is a nationally representative sample of adults 50 and above in the United States. And if you look at life satisfaction trajectories over time at different starting points, you see that actually as people age, they tend to become happier, more satisfied with life. And this kind of extends in the United States, at least, up through the 80s. Life satisfaction tends to go up. More time perhaps for relationships, or better perspective on life, or more leisure time available, or having worked through the struggles of life, but life satisfaction tends to go up. However, if one switches the outcome and looks at purpose in life, you find that maybe unsurprisingly, right around 65, it begins to decline. And again, perhaps unsurprising, that's often when roughly people retire, and there is a notable loss of purpose. So, and I think this sort of data suggests, well, if we're going to focus on well-being of older adults, it would be better to focus on ways to promote a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, rather than on life satisfaction. So again, even this simple descriptive data can be of interest with regard to how do we target, or what sorts of interventions do we target to which groups. Here's a second example. This data was just published in JAMA Psychiatry last month, but we've been trying to collect each year roughly nationally representative data on these different flourishing domains. And what we saw in January 2022 for the first time is that across each and every one of these domains, we've seen hints of this even earlier, but January 2022 for the first time, across each of these domains, the self-rated assessments were strictly increasing with age. That young people, those aged 18 to 25, rated themselves worse than those of all other age groups in happiness and life satisfaction, but also in mental and physical health, and meaning, and character, and close relationships, and financial security. Across the domains, they self-rated themselves most poorly. And this is really in contrast to patterns that had been seen earlier. The traditional shape of at least happiness and life satisfaction with age had been U-shaped, kind of those younger and those older doing better, and those midlife perhaps struggling with career, and young children and aging parents often lowest. And what we've seen over time is that that left part of the U has been flattening. And again, as of January 2022, flattening to the extent that across all 6 of these well-being domains, each of them is increasing with age. So I think this is real cause for concern for our society, for young people. Today, there's been discussion of kind of a mental health crisis amongst youth, but I think the problem is broader. It is well-being more generally. So how do we address this? How do we structure a society that allows young people to thrive? What does this mean for the future of our society? Again, this is just descriptive data, but I think can be of importance with regard to guiding policy discussions. So I think there's a whole lot more we could learn just by collecting data and looking at the distribution and determinants of well-being. I want to transition a little bit now towards etiology, kind of what are the determinants of well-being, and I think there's a lot of work to do here, especially across the life course. Do the determinants vary by life stage, and how so, or by country or cultural context? But hopefully with an eye towards how do we promote well-being? How do we promote flourishing? And if we think about kind of population health impact from a public health lens, often it's considered as a function of two things: the prevalence of the exposure phenomena we're studying and the size of the effect. Something that's common and has large effects, the outcomes we care about is going to shape population health. So, of course, if we use this lens for physical health, we're led to important determinants, important factors like exercise, nutrition, not smoking, sleep, that shape population health. But I think we could potentially, once again, broaden the lens beyond physical health to flourishing, and ask kind of what are the pathways or exposures or phenomena that are both common and have large effects, not just on physical and mental health, but also on happiness, on meaning, on character, on close relationships. And based on review of the literature, I would propose 4, though again, I think a lot more work is needed here, but the list looks rather different than it does for physical health. But those 4 would be family, work, education, and religious community. I think there's evidence from the research literature, more rigorous studies, that each of these is relatively common in the population, both in the United States and worldwide. And each has relatively notable effects on the various flourishing outcomes, evidence from more rigorous longitudinal studies. And the argument here is not that these things are exhaustive. I think there are other pathways which are important for individuals in their flourishing. Arts, engagement in the arts, for example, are very important to some and might enhance all those pathways. I think perhaps that serious engagement is maybe less common in the population. But again, the argument is not that these pathways are in any sense exhausted, nor is the argument that these 4 are necessary. I think one can flourish even in the absence of one or more of these pathways. The argument rather is that each of these, I think, powerfully affects these various domains of flourishing and is common in the population, so that if individual and policy efforts were made towards enhancing these pathways, I think population level flourishing would increase. So this literature review in this paper, the Proceedings National Academy of Sciences, essentially restricted attention to longitudinal, experimental, and quasi-experimental designs. Cross-sectional designs were excluded, and in some cases with this well-being literature that involved discarding the vast majority, 95%, 99% of the literature. Many of the well-being studies have been cross-sectional. But from an epidemiologic perspective, this is really problematic because those designs are generally useless for assessing causality. As simple examples, we know from many studies that marriage and happiness are correlated, but is that because marriage causes happiness, or is that because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? Cross-sectional data, we don't know. Is in fact, I think, good evidence for both, but again, cross-sectional data doesn't allow us to distinguish these. Likewise, religious service attendance is associated with lower depression, but is that because it protects against depression, or is that because those who become depressed withdraw from their religious communities and other forms of community life as well? Again, we can't discern what might be the case unless we have longitudinal data over time. So this literature search was restricted to longitudinal studies, ideally with control for baseline outcomes, hopefully somewhat robust to unmeasured confounding, ideally from multiple sources or even meta analyses. But again, in many cases, this involved discarding many of the studies on sort of religious participation and life satisfaction. At the time of this review, I could find only one study that kind of met these criteria. There have been several since, but again, much of this well-being literature has been cross-sectional in nature. I think that needs to change. I think that could change in part by creating a positive epidemiology, by bringing our epidemiologic knowledge and expertise and methods and designs to this area of well-being research. So this diagram in the paper is sort of a summary of that literature review, the 5 flourishing domains on the right, the 4 proposed pathways on the left, and the numbers on the lines correspond to references of papers using more rigorous designs to provide evidence. In some cases, I think the evidence is pretty clear. In other cases, perhaps just 1 or 2 studies at the time of this literature review contributing, but a lot has been done in the 5 years since. And then again, I think we could use this sort of data and our etiologic analyses to help inform policy decisions. I think often policy decisions are made on the grounds of economic considerations and health considerations, and these are important. These are very important, and I don't want to downplay that. But that's not all people care about. People also care about being happy and having a sense of meaning, about trying to be a good person, about their relationships, and so I think these things should also be taken into account in a policy context, and can potentially lead to different types of decision making. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just as one example in the workplace context, I think taking this broader flourishing lens is important. It's important insofar as I think it makes very clear that welfare policy shouldn't disincentivize work, and often our policies are to provide some sort of income or basic health care to those who are unemployed, and I think that is important and generally well intentioned. But if it's disincentivizing work, I think it's actually neglecting some of the other flourishing outcomes. It's neglecting that work is often an important pathway towards having a sense of meaning and purpose, to developing as a person and making use of one's character strengths, to forming relationships. And while I do think supplying health care and material sustenance is indeed important, I think the extent we can design welfare policies so as to not disincentivize work will allow for the promotion and pursuit of these other well-being outcomes as well, happiness, meaning, relationships, character, and so on. And I think there's been some really good, interesting work on supportive employment programs helping those who are disadvantaged, those mentally ill, finding and sustaining employment, which again I think is helpful for the promotion of flourishing. So could go through a number of other examples, but again I think better etiologic work, a better understanding of the determinants of well-being might be very useful in shaping better, more holistic policies. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the question of distribution, a little bit about determinants. A lot more could be said about both, but I kind of want to conclude this discussion of positive epidemiology, and this will admittedly be a slightly longer conclusion, by describing a different sort of study design template that I think is particularly amenable to the study of flourishing, to the study of well-being, to trying to construct a positive epidemiology. And that's what I'm calling this outcome-wide study design template. And proposed this in a very short paper in epidemiology in 2017. And then as we kind of worked through several examples of this, put together a much longer paper on doing this in practice and some of the statistical and design and methodological considerations in this paper in 2020 in statistical science. And sort of the idea from this originally arose from sort of proposals for an exposure-wide epidemiology, I think in part drawing upon the success of GWAS studies. But exposure-wide epidemiology, I think, is actually a lot more complicated, because if you look at exposures along the life course, each of those exposures has different potential confounding factors. So for every exposure, you need to make a separate set of decisions, consideration that really doesn't arise in the GWAS setting. So I think exposure-wide, potentially of interest is actually very difficult to do and not much more straightforward than just running a bunch of separate independent studies. But I think the outcome-wide context is a little different. If we fix an exposure and look at the potential effects or evidence for effects on a host of outcomes, there we can actually use a fairly uniform design where we fix our exposure, we control as confounders for a rich set of all of the past as much as sort of the data can tolerate, and then fit the same sorts of models for each of our outcome, controlling for that rich set of confounders in the past. So it's a pretty simple idea. Again, fix exposure, look at potential effects on a host of outcomes, regress each outcome on the exposure and the same rich set of prior confounding variables, one at a time. One doesn't lose a whole lot of statistical power, a little bit, but not a whole lot doing this. But by kind of standardizing the analysis, one can both gain insight into the potential effects on a range of outcomes all at once, but one also kind of eliminates investigator degrees of freedom. There's often concern in empirical research that the investigators have played around with the regression models or the covariate choice to get the results that they want. And if you're making the same set of decisions for all outcomes, while one might still be playing around with one regression model, if you're committed to fitting the same regression model for all the other outcomes, it doesn't eliminate that issue of investigator degrees of freedom, but it does reduce, it does mitigate partially. So that's the basic idea. Again, pretty simple. There are some, I think, interesting methodological questions, which I'll briefly comment on, but again, a whole lot more detail in the paper on kind of how to do this in a reasoned, principled, sensible way. But the question of covariate control is a little bit complicated when you're looking at multiple outcomes at once. The proposal in this paper is to control for any covariate, which may in practice be a pretty large set, but any covariate that is a potential cause of the exposure or of any of the many outcomes, and control for the same set across outcomes, again, to reduce this investigator degrees of freedom and to allow for a greater comparability of results across outcomes. There are some technicalities. One may want to discard anything which is a known instrumental variable or include things which are proxies for common causes of exposure and outcome. But the basic idea is cause of the exposure of any outcome could be controlled, ideally in the wave prior to the exposure assessment, at least if the data has been collected frequently enough to try to eliminate concern about is a particular covariate a confounder or a mediator? Is one doing over control? If it's in the wave prior, if the covariates are in the wave prior, then they could only be confounders. They can't be mediators because they're prior to the exposure. So more on this in some of these papers here on principles of confounder selection, but really it's just applying those principles to this outcome-wide template. So I think doing so is not appropriate in all settings. It really requires at least thousands, sample sizes in the thousands. With 5 to 10,000, we found this works reasonably well, and one still has fairly good power to detect evidence for these associations. But again, I think one does, because of the proposed approach, one does want to be a bit careful with regard to sample size. The second proposal, this paper, is to supplement each of these estimates with a sensitivity analysis for unmeasured confounding. And I've put forward a very simple metric to do this. There are lots of techniques out there, but one very simple metric to do this is what I've called the E value, which put forward in this paper of Annals Internal Medicine in 2017. Again, I think there are plenty of other good sensitivity analysis techniques, which in some ways are preferable to the E value. but the e-value is a particularly simple way to carry out sensitivity analysis. And because of the simplicity, I think especially amenable to these outcome-wide studies where you're trying to summarize a lot of information in a short amount of space. So e-values definition is just the minimum strength of association on a risk ratio scale that an unmeasured confounder would have to have with both the exposure and the outcome to explain away the effect estimate. So if we thought we had some unmeasured confounder, and if we let RRUY be the association maximum risk ratio between any two categories of U and the outcome, conditional on the measured covariates and the exposure, and RRAU be the maximum risk ratio relating any two categories of U to the exposure, conditional on the measured covariates, then one can show that if your estimated risk ratios of magnitude RR, then if both of those two parameters were greater than this quantity here, the risk ratio plus the square root of the risk ratio times the risk ratio minus 1, so you can do this by hand calculator, but we also have R packages and Stata packages and online e-value calculators if you don't want to do this yourself. But if both of those parameters were larger than that quantity, then that degree of confounding associations could suffice, but weaker confounding associations could not. So the proposal in this paper is just to report this e-value for both the estimate and the limit of the confidence interval closest to the null as a very simple and very crude sensitivity analysis for each of the outcomes. But one can essentially report these e-values for all outcomes in one single table. And I'll give an example very shortly. More details in the paper. Because of the simplicity, this has become a very popular approach. This e-value paper has been cited over 2,000 times since it was introduced five years ago. Again, I think there are other very good sensitivity analysis techniques, but for something very crude, and especially I think in this outcome-wide context, this e-value approach can be a valuable way of assessing sensitivity to unmeasured confounding. And then finally, third methodologic point with these outcome-wide studies is I do think multiple testing needs to be taken seriously. We're looking at a host of outcomes simultaneously, and we need to acknowledge that. And there are different ways of doing this. What we've typically done is kind of reported certainly nominal p-values for each of the associations, and then kind of reporting on whether that p-value passes certain thresholds. I don't think there's anything magical about any threshold, 0.05 or 0.005. I mean, p-value is a continuous measure of evidence, but I think it can be helpful sometimes to report also what happens under Bonferroni correction, kind of noting the possibility that some of the evidence may seemingly arise simply because one is conducting so many tests. There are also other, I think, desirable and more sophisticated ways to do this correction for multiple testing. I won't go through all details here, but I do think in one way or another, the fact that one is looking at multiple outcomes really does need to be acknowledged from a statistical standpoint. So we can potentially come back to this in Q&A, but I do think it's a third methodologic subtlety with these outcome-wide studies that needs to be acknowledged. I think these outcome-wide studies have a number of advantages. They convey a whole lot more information than a traditional study. So I think there's a much greater efficiency for the researcher, for the reader, for the reviewers, for the editors. It's a much more rapid advancement of knowledge. We're sort of publishing, in some sense, 50 papers in one. I think it's also advantageuse because it allows for a much easier publication of null results also. If we find evidence for effects on 10 outcomes and no evidence or little evidence for 40, you can report them all at once, including the 40 outcomes where there just isn't much evidence. And I think that's very valuable. It's sort of publication bias. The difficulty of publishing null results is very clear. And it's hard enough to publish one. Can you imagine trying to publish 40 null results? I mean, it could take you the next decade to be able to succeed at that. So these outcome-wide studies, I think, allow for easier publication of null results, less temptation to choose amongst models because you're taking a standardized approach across all outcomes, easier comparison of effect sizes across outcomes. I think easier evaluation of policy implications. Certain exposures, hormone replacement therapy, for example, have beneficial effects on some outcomes and detrimental effects on others, and one can see this all at once. So again, I think the outcome-wide studies not the right solution for all contexts. I don't think there will be anything that ever fully replaces a careful epidemiologic study with single exposure and single outcome. But in a number of settings, I think using this outcome-wide template would allow for both a more rapid and also a more accurate, in terms of publishing null results and reducing investigator degrees of freedom, more accurate and more rapid expansion of knowledge. So I think there are a number of advantages. I'm not going to go through this in detail because I do want to allow some time for questions, but just as a very simple example, we've looked at associations between forgiveness of others, for example, and a host of other well-being outcomes. This is from data from the Growing Up Today study, the children of the nurses and the nurses' health study, a sample here of about 7,000 individuals. Forgiveness of others and other assessments of forgiveness were measured in 2007, controlled for a rich set of social demographic and health factors in 2007 and before, and then looked at a host of different outcomes in 2010 and 2013, 3 to 6 years later. So I'm just going to report essentially the associations from a series of different regressions, and then a table of e-values to give you a sense as to what this outcome-wide sort of analysis looks like. So these are controlling typically for baseline outcomes, as well as a host of social demographic and health characteristics. But doing so found evidence for association of forgiveness of others. This is the first column here, with various aspects of psychological well-being, life satisfaction, positive affect, self-esteem, emotional processing and expression. Very little evidence, in fact, for effects on physical health. And this has been an interesting area of dispute in the forgiveness literature, but in this study, little evidence for associations with physical health. Some evidence at least for effects on depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and that's been fairly consistent with other studies as well. And then some evidence for effects 3 to 6 years later on volunteering, on time given to charity or a place of worship. So in any case, this gives you some sense as to what these look like. Looks like the strongest effects really are on psychological well-being and depressive and anxiety symptoms. But one can then report e-values for the estimates and for the limit of the confidence interval closest to the null. So you can do this for all outcomes. The interpretation here for life satisfaction would be something along the lines of, with an e-value of 1.77, for an unmeasured confounder to explain away our association between forgiveness and subsequent life satisfaction. An unmeasured confounder that was associated with both forgiving others and with life satisfaction by risk ratios of 1.77-fold each above and beyond the measured covariates could suffice, but weaker confounding associations could not. For an unmeasured confounder to shift the confidence interval to include the null, an unmeasured confounder that was associated with both other forgiveness and life satisfaction by risk ratios of 1.56-fold each above and beyond the measured confounders could suffice, but weaker confounding could not. So here, pretty strong confounding would be needed to explain away, say, our estimates on life satisfaction or on say, anxiety symptoms. It's not definitive, but given the rich set of confounders, it does seem we probably do still have some evidence here. So again, I'm not going to go through all of the results here. With the physical health, it might have been the younger population, but we've repeated this with the nurses in the nurses' health study, and likewise find not much association with physical health, but again, evidence for effects on depression and anxiety. And these analyses were actually useful for informing design of randomized trial of a forgiveness intervention, where we sort of selected our primary outcomes, not just forgiveness, but anxiety, depression, based on what the observational data suggested was most likely to change. So that randomized trial was just recently finished, sampled about 3,000 or 4,000 individuals in five different countries: Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. And we hope the results will be published later this year. So I'll leave you in suspense as to what those results might have been. But things did give a preview look quite promising. And so I think a case could be made that forgiveness is potentially a public health issue, that this is something that we can intervene on, in this case, through a simple do-it-yourself workbook intervention that can have profound effects on mental health. That kind of experience of being wronged is common. And we have these resources that can promote not just forgiveness, but well-being, health and well-being more generally. So I think these sorts of outcome-wide studies can be useful in understanding etiology, useful for advancing knowledge more rapidly, useful in intervention and trial design, and hopefully ultimately useful for the promotion of well-being. So we've published a number of these other outcome-wide studies on various positive exposure topics: volunteering, positive parenting, social cohesion, savings and credit, hope, religious upbringing, life satisfactions, and submission, looking at how each of these phenomena affect subsequent outcomes. So in conclusion, I think flourishing is important. I think it pertains to all of life. I think we should, in our research, examine a broader set of outcomes. I think this outcome-wide approach can help us to do so. I think we need better support in terms of government funding, university funding. I would argue also hiring and promotion to examine a broader set of outcomes, not just physical and mental health, but also happiness, meaning, character, social relationships. I think we should start tracking this at kind of national levels, but also in universities and in workplaces and medical centers and schools. I really do think that what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, the policies we put in place to achieve it. I think we should be aiming for flourishing personally and as a community. And I think the creation of a positive epidemiology would allow us to better achieve these aims. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. A lot to think about. I've actually have a doctoral student, Jason Ha, who can hopefully help with the Q&A, just because it's difficult up here in the lectern. So I might pass it over to Jason.
Yeah, so there's actually one question here from Sarah Solomon asking about, have these questions been tested, thought about for low-income, urban, Black, and Brown communities, Dr. VanderWeele?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. The data we've collected to date in the United States, at least, when we've looked at inequalities and disparities, we've kind of found this standard patterns one finds with income and financial stability and with health. But interestingly, on some of these other flourishing domains, you actually find the Black communities doing better on meaning and purpose, on social relationships, and maybe a slightly higher character assessments as well. And so I think this doesn't in any way mean we shouldn't be addressing those health and income disparities, but I think it is also pointing to strengths of these communities as well, that we've perhaps overlooked or neglected. So I think there's a lot to learn by looking at these various aspects of well-being in different communities across different racial groups, across different cultures.
Jason, I have a question. Should I jump in, or is there?
I don't think there's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of my research is in pediatric epidemiology, and I'm fortunate to also work with two talented PhD students who are focusing their projects on pediatric epidemiology. A lot of the items that you described in the flourishing domains, it was difficult to see easy connections with children. And I'm curious whether there's anything in the literature that's designed for child development or child flourishing that is as well studied.
Yeah, so we have adapted this flourishing assessment for an adolescent population where 8 of the 12 questions are the same, and then 4 have been altered to sort of take into account the developmental stages. There's been some cognitive testing work actually done by a group at Hopkins on the adolescent version, and it's performed pretty well. We've probably collected data in 8 to 10 settings on this adolescent version to date, but most of that's not yet published. If you're interested, you can download that from the Human Flourishing Program website. So while we've not yet kind of published the validation studies, it looks like it's performing pretty well. There's a woman here at the Human Flourishing Program focused on flourishing and education who's trying to examine whether this adolescent version might work with like 10 to 12-year-olds. And that, that's, I wouldn't want to kind of put it forward yet for a group that young, but she's pretty optimistic that it will be effective there as well. I'd be really hesitant going younger than that with regard to these, self-report.
Sure. That's very helpful. And I think another thing, because I work in a domain of pediatric kidney disease where there are also there can be developmental problems. How does that relate to these sort of flourishing data collection efforts? If there, are populations that may have difficulty answering those questions, how are they included or evaluated?
Yeah, so I think any severe health issue is going to be an impediment to flourishing, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. It's not that one can't flourish in the context of ill health, but that that is an aspect of life that's not going well. But at times, I think those very struggles can in fact lead to deeper relationships, or to reflect on one's life and find new meaning. And so, I think using these flourishing assessments actually can help someone realize that some aspects of their life are in fact going well, even though their health might not be. More broadly, I do think including these sorts of assessments in clinical settings is important in clinical decision making, because I think in other contexts, decisions that are made that might have beneficial effects on the primary clinical condition may have really severe adverse side effects on life, which may inhibit flourishing. I was talking with a surgeon not long ago who said, we know from randomized trials that our surgeries improve years of disease-free survival, and yet I have patients coming back 6 months saying they want to die because the side effects are so bad. We need to know this, and I think, to my mind, ideally have some empirical quantitative data on how these different options, how these different treatment modalities are affecting these other aspects of well-being.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. So I'm just gonna combine John Jackson's and Nandita's question here in the chat. Basically, the question has something to do with has the Gallup poll that you're doing considered contextual determinants in these components of flourishing, considering that there are cultural differences in our understanding of happiness, purpose, well-being, all of the domains that you have mentioned. So if you could speak a little bit about how that was taken into account as the survey was being developed and rolled out in these different countries.
Yeah, so we do have a number of contextual variables concerning perception of the community, concerning issues of political voice, concerning issues of discrimination, sort of satisfaction with city, various aspects of community participation, family life. The survey is sort of a mile wide and an inch deep. So, with each of these contextual variables, we typically have one single item. We tried to shape that by soliciting expert advice in each area and each domain, and then receiving kind of global feedback from about 170 scholars around the world. I mean, I'm sure in 3 years' time we'll look back and say, oh, we should have collected data on something else. But we do have some. I'm sure anyone using the data would prefer a richer set of contextual and communal determinants, but we do have some. The data will be geocoded to 1 degree latitude and longitude, so it can, in principle, be matched at least at a relatively crude level with other databases and surveys to try to get additional information on contextual determinants. With regard to the well-being assessments themselves, we have been trying to do cross-cultural work on well-being, getting sort of non-Western perspectives on the topic. That's sort of an independent initiative with Gallup, but we've been incorporating the results of that into the study. Kind of questions of balance, peace, harmony tend to be given greater emphasis in Eastern than Western contexts. That's kind of one of the first immediate things that emerged, and so we've incorporated that into the Global Flourishing study as well. And I'm sure it's still shaped by a Western perspective, in spite of all of these efforts that we have made to try to make this more universal, more global. But we will be adapting the work in the survey over time as we learn more about cross-cultural and non-Western perspectives on well-being.
Thank you so much, Dr. VanderWeele. This was a terrific talk. So much to think about. Such a delight to have you and sharing your work. I wish you well in all these remarkable research efforts that you have going forth. You have a lot of projects going on.
Well, thank you.
And
yeah, a pleasure being here, and I apologize for such a wide-ranging presentation, but wanted to get on well-being, a little bit on positive epidemiology, and at least a piece or two on methods as well. But so it has been.
And that's why we're working on this as a translational epi project. So that's what the seminar is about. I think, bridging all of these methodologic, applied, and domain-specific questions in epidemiology. So thank you again, and thank you to all the students and the people online for participating and listening.